The Blob and I, Part 1. We have seen the future, and it doesn't work. Like the influential Communist Manifesto, I am combining both description and prescription here. Unlike that document, however, I do not call upon history, which I consider to be a supernatural, man-made and deliberately biased selection of events designed to justify and conceal the political action that ambitious people personally desire. Nor do I urge others to follow my instructions, but just to copy my example. Instead, I call upon fun as an authentic motivation, unpolluted with fake certainty about the future, which does not belong to us, but to those who will have to live in it. Let fun be the spectre that haunts those madmen who believe they know what the future will bring. We can only do our best to know what happened in the past and learn from it. Together, logic, love and levity will help guide our steps forward into the unknown. What starts here as a rather depressing description ends up as an uplifting narrative. What is the blob? Sometimes a potent metaphor is stumbled upon which clarifies what was previously only vaguely sensed. A few years ago, Michael Gove, the British Education Secretary, found all his attempts to reform the failing education system blocked by a conglomerate of bureaucrats, academics and teachers' unions. He began referring to them as the Blob, presumably after the 1958 science fiction film about an amorphous mass that absorbed human beings like a giant amoeba. He may have underestimated the extent and rapid growth of the blob, which is mindlessly heaving and swelling and threatening to absorb the whole of mankind. The blob has succeeded in absorbing most of the education-controlling institutions, not only those driven by materialistic utilitarian aims, which are increasingly validated by reduction to digital economic assessment in a money-governed economy, but even by the traditional universal churches, claiming validation by their commitment to transcendental love. Having lost their professional ethics and independence, these institutions were quickly corrupted by the economic and political aims of the military-industrial complex, which had mushroomed during the Second World War and continued to grow during the Cold War. Academics stood by as independent newspapers and telecommunication networks were furtively taken over and formed into a tiny number of monopolies by businessmen who would never allow a journalist to reveal the truth about the concrescence of the life-sucking, currency-manipulating, fake news-creating, warmongering blob. The amorphous mass of incorporated institutions which make up the blob is united by one overriding aim: the will to power, which since the late 19th century has increasingly become the leitmotif of Western civilization. These institutions and the individuals trapped in them have become so entangled that any sign of personal, responsible action based on the will to love, in other words, simply being true to oneself and to be left alone to do one's job, is punished by marginalisation, accusations of antisocial ego-tripping, racism, sexism, etc., and even dismissal and impoverishment. No rational explanation needs to be given. The rule of law itself is being overruled by the revised Jacobin doctrine of egalitarian human rights, based on mainly simplistic, somatic differences such as gender, sexual preferences, skin colour and ethnicity, and applied with the full force of new laws based on the subjective interpretation of hurt feelings. The rights and responsibilities of such fundamental social role relationships as mother-child, husband-wife, citizen-foreigner, etc., based on the will to love, are being dissolved in an acid bath of hate based on the will to power. The only roles that have retained their legitimacy are those of the managerial classes, who have no human values other than power to enforce their rapidly multiplying new legalistic rules. Managers are skilled at taking power and avoiding responsibility. They are aided in this by the targeted use of fear and hysteria in the mass education and mass media institutions to demonize conservative critics who regard free speech and the rule of law as far more important than bureaucratic obfuscation and hypothetical hurt feelings. Challenges to the omnipotent Blob. The world has witnessed the power of the Blob in the recent campaign for the presidency of America. Like a jack-in-a-box, a wealthy entrepreneur who had become a media celebrity popped up using the cunning tricks of his profession to outsmart his rival in the Republican Party, who lacked his chutzpah and did not have the media celebrity machine behind them to become the Republican candidate. The Blob rose up to absorb this outsider, and the world watched in horror as respected ruling elites began hurling excrement like Swift's disgusting yahoos. The previous Democratic Party's warmongering foreign policies of regime change, which led to moving US and NATO troops up to the western border of Russia, and the unmonitored pouring of weapons into Syria to overthrow the non-Sunni government, escapes all criticism by those who have been absorbed into the Blob and have lost all their mental marbles. The raging fury against Trump was almost off the meter. This antichrist had not only legally dodged paying some income tax, but private recordings of his locker room boasting about bottom pinching and groping 30 years ago produces reactions like old ladies when someone says bum at a tea party. A reasonable case for building a monitored wall between Mexico and the USA to act as a national border to control the out-of-control drug trade and massive illegal immigration was made independently before the election, and Trump's plans to avoid confrontation with Russia over Syria, which the deep state forced him to abandon, was regarded as proof that he is the demonized Putin stooge and enemy of America. Such a furore was not even anything new. A few weeks earlier, in the case of Brexit, the British government, confident of winning, made the colossal mistake of letting people vote in a referendum to decide if they would remain in the European Union or leave it. There was no reasoned debate, since nearly all the mass media and mass education institutions were embedded in the Blob. The Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer produced fake future economic projections, which prophesied terrifying consequences if the people voted to leave the trading agreement, which had slowly morphed to become an irresponsible political superpower or blob run by Germany. Against all protocol, President Obama personally intervened before the referendum by appearing on television to warn the people of Britain as they voted to leave, they would end up at the back of the queue in future trade deals with the USA. Which leader of which superpower is influencing voting in an independent election in another country here? However, to everyone's amazement, and against the directives of all main political parties, the people voted to leave, and what had become in practice the United States of Europe, structured by the euro, in turn controlled by the Deutsche Bank. The people of the British Isles have a deep desire for independence and hundreds of years of resisting attempts by continental powers to invade them or turn them into their puppets. The Blob was forced to retreat, cursing those who wanted Britain to regain their sovereignty and the power to make their own laws. The Brexiteers were abused as racists and mocked as ignorant rural yokels or senile old fools by the glittering metropolitans and media lovies living in luxury in London, the great banking city. For the first time, the Blob showed it was not all powerful. Who are in the Blob? It's an impressive list. The financial wizards who rule the world by manipulating the currencies through criminal financial institutions, the gigantic global corporations who, by becoming legal persons in law, cannot be held accountable for their piratical practices, the hedge funders, stock marketeers, etc., in cahoots with corrupt bankers who help them manipulate the value of stocks, many of them fake, and the political parties who make lying promises to the electorate to get into power and who will loot the tax take to bail the banks out when their crooked schemes backfire. They are too big to fail. Also in the Blob is the mass media, with very few exceptions a monopoly, all singing from the same page, as are the taxpayer-supported universities, teachers' colleges, and teachers' unions of a secular education system. The gutless second-rate intellectuals in traditional Christian churches who daren't be rude to the usurers manipulating their governments, or the Islamic jihadists slaughtering their colleagues in the original churches in Syria, and turning a blind eye to female genital mutilations and sexual slavery, have also been absorbed by the Blob. All are being digested in the acid bath of the Blob. No matter how much they struggle, they cannot escape and are being turned into spineless pap. Although most of its individual components are salaried professionals rather than wage earners, the Blob acts as a whole, a unitary and hypersensitive emotional being, compressed into a monetarised managerial carapace. When its expansion is blocked, virtue signalling like mad, the Blob spews out a cloud of fake news, politically correct poison gas, and unverifiable accusations of personal scandal and so on. Clearly, the sovereignty of nation-states is being seriously eroded by secret, managerialised trade agreements, empowering free-floating global corporations with new laws which overrule the laws of previously sovereign states. But who else is being destroyed by the Blob? Professional associations lose control over their members and are instead subject to ill-informed, short-sighted, bean-counting managers. Independent blue-collar workers are being rapidly impoverished, made homeless, and driven into servile dependency on the beneficiary system. Even the lower echelons of the white-collar class are suffering, and new information technology will soon drive them down into penury. Peasants all over the world have lived for generations in balance with their natural environment, are being developed against their will by having their land seized, being compulsorily educated and urbanised, and seeing the traditional cultural values destroyed. The Blob knows what's good for them, whether they like it or not, and is addicted to its power. What are the psychological, social and cultural phenomenon of the Blob? As Shakespeare put it, all the world's a stage, but few people question the script or cultural scenario. All human beings live in cultures with adaptive and integrative values such as truth, goodness and beauty, which are institutionally structured and provide the necessary roles to implement these values. These role actors, in turn, are recruited from families who first socialise the young. Regardless of the firm belief of left-leaning educationalists, the psyches of the children are not tabula rasa, and although partly formed by their parents' training and example and life experiences, they also partly formed by deep inherited innate release response mechanisms, which have been evolving for millions of years. I've been describing the blob as an internally consistent, collective cultural psychosis. All cultures up to now can be at least partly described in this way, but they vary widely in the amount of coercion needed to ensure enduring integration and adaptation to their environments. In the past, Nazi Germany and Communist Russia were collective psychotic states maintained by extreme coercion. Today, Communist North Korea is a good example of this, and the Kingdom of Bhutan is a good example of the exact opposite. Scientology, a blob within the blob. Blob-like entities, using extreme coercion, can exist within less psychotic nation-states, even though unable to call upon the services of their own armed police or military. I can think of no better example than Scientology, which has achieved a degree of success not even reached by totalitarian religious cults. The scenario is no more than a cheap science fiction fantasy of its founder, a paranoid schizophrenic. This is hidden to most and is not itself the attraction of this fake secular religion with its aliens instead of gods. Like secular education in general, the attraction is the promise of increased self-awareness and personal power to improve the current world. Gnosis, or secret knowledge of the higher truth, is only revealed to adepts after thousands of hours of study under teacher guides. These teachers use a basic galvanic skin response meter they have renamed an E-meter to magically provide a scientific measure of the accuracy of their statements so they can move up to the next of an unending series of levels of consciousness. Our civilization's absolute commitment to education as a continuously monitored process motivated by Our civilization's absolute commitment to education as a continuously monitored process motivated by future promises of status, power and money has reached its apogee in Scientology. Like the student loan racket in the state education systems, adepts soon become deeply indebted and work at slave labour rates for their masters to pay for the enhanced bills incurred. Within this mini-blob are all the important professionals that can be found in the big blob, especially media manipulators, masters of business administration, and lawyers. In the absence of legal uniformed police, there are a large number of Gestapo-like private investigators who intimidate those who manage to escape, as well as their families, and who spread fake news about them and their colleagues and friends through the social media. Foolish media celebrities are flattered and feted and treated like spoilt brats to provide status to this increasingly wealthy organisation, which has invested widely in property. Like those at the top of the pyramid of the worldwide blob, its current leader, who has achieved almost absolute power within the organisation, enjoys humiliating people and beating them up. Scientology, even with its naive scientism, has a sophisticated propaganda machine and makes widespread use of fear. It is therefore an excellent example of how a collective psychosis can be created and sustained within a much saner society. This is only possible when the wider society itself is disintegrating and traditional values are being deconstructed by power-addicted academic social science educationalists. All you need is love becomes all you want is power. There was a brief period in our recent history when the will to love and laugh suddenly arose to defy the will to power. For more than 10 years, the popular English masters of fun, led by Spike Milligan's imaginative goon show, broadcast weekly by the BBC throughout the British Commonwealth, had been revealing the absurd behaviour of the boring rulers of the new post-war establishment of money and power. At that time, young English musicians, coming from this background, as well as skiffle and traditional British folk music, began their transformation of the underground, rather self-pitying blues music. Beatlemania infected people from all walks of life. The Beatles' visit to America in particular started the public recognition of the marginalised rhythm and blues music of the USA, which was ready and waiting for it. Other British musical groups and pop artists soon followed. Meanwhile, the West Coast hippies, influenced by the international thinkers gathered at the Esalen Institute, including environmentalists, psychologists, sociologists, and theologians from both East and West, were challenging not only the conformist consumer culture, but the very foundations of Western industrial society. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. This is how Charles Dickens described a similar historical situation in the opening lines of The Tale of Two Cities, the most popular best-selling novel in history until Lord of the Rings. There has been no more brilliant literary description of the situation. For a few years, as there was then, there was a new hope and trust that our civilization would be revitalized. But the terror created by the egalitarian lawyers led by the Directorate and the dictator Napoleon soon put an end to that. The American gung-ho, go-it-alone attempt to stop the spread of Soviet imperialism in Vietnam led to the eclipse of the newly arising will to love. They'd halted the Soviet push successfully in Korea when they worked together with the United Nations. But this time they used fake news about a naval incident that never took place as an excuse to start the war, and tried to run it by remote control using computers, chance-based conscription, and with local people as puppet soldiers. Communist Russia, who were the puppet masters of the Communist North, as they had been in Korea, took advantage of the resulting incompetent, indiscriminate and ineffectual American violence, especially against civilians. They made a determined attempt to destroy the USA from within by a barrage of propaganda aimed at the useful idiots in the universities, which had suddenly grown in numbers, especially in the social science departments, who apparently had no appreciation of the role being played by the Soviet Russians in what was essentially a Vietnamese civil war of industrial North versus agricultural South. Hatred of their country filled the air, and the alternative society lost its autonomy by joining in to become an alienated counterculture. Soon the word power as the reason for action replaced the word love everywhere, and images of clenched fists replaced those of flowers. Even the majority of hippies, who had sought independence from their cold-hearted, intolerant authority of their seniors through practicing a lifestyle based on love and freedom, abandoned their original search for community and lost themselves in the mindless escapism of sex, drugs and rock and roll. Resentment. 100 years ago, the philosopher Max Scheler showed how Nietzsche's resentment, a psychological mechanism he claimed was based on the will to power, operates in weakening or even inverting such fundamental values as virtue, love, self-sacrifice, modesty and healthy living. This will to power is experienced as an irrational sense of moral superiority. Scheler claimed that Nietzsche's rejection of Christianity as weakness was no doubt influenced by Darwin and blinded him to the power of the will to love. Darwin's evolutionary theory, only imperfectly understood, had already laid the foundations for the false and wicked idea of survival of the fittest. This reduced the complex ecosystems of life and its social arrangements into mere retrospective and tautologous survival of individual organisms through fighting, fornicating and fertility, now seen as the meaning of life. This becomes justification for an ideology which commits its believers to the view that organisms are survival machines with no authentic, autonomous intentionality or agency. A terrible mistake is often made by those self-righteous individuals, often with an inferiority complex, who believe in power for its own sake. They delude themselves and protect their fragile egos with the belief that attacking and destroying what they believe to be evil is the same thing as protecting and cherishing what they believe to be good. This is exactly what the young jihadist martyrs of ISIS believe. Developing wisdom, courage, and unassertive self-sacrifice requires much more ego strength. Such angry, self-righteous people are completely opposed to the reflexive golden rule of Confucius. Jesus took reciprocal love even further, with agape, which involves forgiving one's enemies, even though they've intentionally harmed one. Such love is offered freely, without calculation, like Shakespeare's quality of mercy, which cannot be enforced and may even be rejected. Born in the universities as student power. I believe that it was in the new sociology departments of the 1960s that the Blob originated, or at least took on its present autonomous form. It could be said to have been conceived on the campus at Berkeley as the free speech movement in the mid-1960s. This meant free speech for the power-seeking left wing, of course. Following 1968, that amazing year of cultural transformations, it metamorphed into the anti-free speech movement in the universities, which mushroomed in the early 1970s. Anyone who criticised the shallow left ideology and violent behaviour of the student power leaders who had suddenly taken over the student unions and their funds, together with the student newspapers, was just shouted down and marginalised. Universities were the first public institutions in the West since World War II to openly prevent free speech by the use of force. The cowardly, bureaucratised academics did nothing. Consequently, 45 years later, following the 2016 victory of the non-Blob Republican Party candidate in the American election, the hysterical behaviour of many academics, administrators and students in senior universities in their self-righteous echo chambers has been unbelievably bizarre. The founders and leaders of the 1970s resentment-motivated protest movement throughout the Western world were so driven by their will to power, they soon reached important positions in the political, educational and media institutions. The traditional authorities were despised for their out-of-date values of love, playfulness and concern for the people, described as patronising, cosmetic or propping up an evil system. Cutting-edge, progressive administrative ideas were embraced by the rising classes of enlightened, salaried, white-collar executives in the cities, regardless of the consequences for the working classes and rural dwellers. They regarded such people as uneducated fascists, sexist and racist anyway, or even worse, bigoted and deluded Christians. This bourgeois empowerment process was not new, but it accelerated in the universities, now almost completely devoted to serving mammon, and soon went out of control to embrace continuous assessment, student loans, and to expand rapidly to become the monetarised managerial blob. The axial age origins of contemporary consciousness. All human beings, except madmen and soulless mechanical bureaucrats, live as role actors in social groups, whose interaction can only take place if there's some sort of symbolic validation. Since the axial age, around 600 BC, that validation has taken forms depending ultimately on either transcendental supernatural authority or on reductionist materialistic utilitarianism. Put simplistically, either the mandate of heaven or the mandate of the people. Accordingly, personal validation and purely personal agency is uncommon. However, experience teaches us that the only single liminal individuals acting solely on their own personal authority can deconstruct the blob, as the mercurial Nigel Farage and the stubborn but cunning deal-making Donald Trump in their limited ways have both shown. In terms of Victor Turner's theory of social transformations, both major American political parties are, at the time of writing, social anti-structures, and both will be going through the communitas stage before becoming revitalised social structures. The Brexit phenomenon in the UK went much deeper, but no politically organised group has arisen yet in the splintered multi-party arena to represent those who voted to leave. The signs in continental Europe of discontent over the loss of cultural identity are more hopeful for the development of such temporary political, social anti-structures. Reductionist identity politics. The influential post-war Parisian school of deconstructionists were neo-Marxists who described the institutions in contemporary society as little more than manifestation of the Nietzschean will to power. They were academic intellectuals employed by the state whose assessments would therefore determine the employment prospects of their students in the French public service. One can imagine the fate of any of them who dared disagree with their virtue-signalling teachers. They would soon experience the workings of power for themselves. Despite their deliberately obscure language and neologisms, these academics became celebrity intellectuals, and by the 1970s, social scientists everywhere ceased analysing social systems as interlocking, reciprocating role-action complexes and had adopted their mechanistic conflict models. In their new view, human individuals are little more than biological machines and consequently cannot act out roles. Their behaviour is determined by social, Darwinist, historical inevitability, which, like the market forces of the atheistical capitalist, is a loveless, puritanical economic mechanism. People who act out their social roles responsibly are despised, superficial conformists. At the mere thought of a violent, Jacobin uprising like the hyped-up student riots in Paris in 1968, they become as excited at the prospect of the catastrophic end of civilization as a schizophrenic prophet of doom. The Blob actively discriminates against those responsible people who hold society together. Human rights legislation, which can be imposed over the customary law of the land, not only carries few, if any, reciprocal responsibilities, but in practice only applies to certain categories of being human. Some people are more human than others. To break down any collective resistance to their increasing power over everyone's lives, teachers, who are now all certified in the mass compulsory secular education system, have been trained, without necessarily being conscious of this, to create deep divisions in the population through new gender, racial and religious identity politics. Inventing identity politics to destroy the will to love. The first step is to identify a target group who must be made to feel by their educators like victims and to be told who to blame. Secular human rights, without any reciprocal responsibilities, were adopted from the French Revolution and are imposed by coercion or emotional blackmail. Women are still being told they must be empowered or risk being ridiculed by their intellectual superiors, and are encouraged to turn against their sons, husbands and fathers who, being male, are, ipso facto, sexists. Women cannot be sexists because they were born as victims. Women are no longer allowed to act as responsible mothers, exercising authority over male children so they can love them and be held accountable, because they are not role actors, they are just women. Men are no longer allowed to act as responsible husbands, exercising authority over their wives so that they can love them and be held accountable for their treatment of them, because they are not role actors, they are just men. Men, however, can't be victims because they are all born as sexists. The result is that children are being continuously encouraged in the mass media and mass education systems to reject the authority of their parents. And for the first time in history, all wives are being urged by governments who control the compulsory education institutions to reject the status authority of their husbands in all fields of competence. The common values that bind communities and nations had to be destroyed to prevent any democratic opposition to the increasing power of the Blob. Racial and religious minorities were targeted and told they were victims of discrimination unless they compelled the traditional society they had chosen to live in to abandon their own traditional values and grant them equal rights. In England, some schools banned the celebration of Christmas because it might upset recent Muslim immigrants. No one considered banning Islamic holy days in their madrasas, and the Blob-controlled government turned a blind eye to the teaching of an extreme version of a jihadist philosophy that Christians and Jews were not human, but evil. Fundamentalist Muslims were not even prevented from preaching the virtues of female genital mutilation and execution of homosexuals. In Europe and North America, those diehards consistently practicing their Christian and traditional humanistic values are being defined as racists and discriminated against. Religious and racial minorities cannot be racist because educationalists in the Blob have defined them as ipso facto victims. The Blob empowers itself at everyone else's expense. The Blob doesn't just divide and rule, it aims blindly at the progressive destruction of the traditional culture of an entire people using recently arrived ignorant minority groups, married women wanting their own way for its own sake, and rebellious, immature youngsters to undermine the entire ideological and historical foundations of successfully functioning cultures. Love without responsible, legitimate power is impotent. Irresponsible power without responsible love is brutal tyranny, in other words, the blob. The professional monetarised managers, social engineers, in the blob, who control the bureaucratically administered empowering process through their monopoly of education, thrive on creating victims and disempowering those people trying to love them. No one notices or points out that this empowering and disempowering process makes them all dependent on the blob, which is itself greatly empowered by it. One ring to rule them all. Neophilia replaces respect for the wisdom of the past, and as the magician-poet W.B. Yeats prophesied just after the First World War, things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The corporate blob's destruction of human communities is enabled not only by the all-encompassing nanny state, a bureaucracy funded by compulsory income tax, but is increasingly empowered by new hate speech laws. Having begun in the university in 1968, free speech, that most precious protection against the growth of tyranny, is being stifled and legally punished. If any collectivity defined as a targeted victim group, women for example, claims that their feelings have been hurt by a statement which may or may not be true, and where no specific act of discrimination of any kind can be shown, action can still be taken to punish the offender. As in witch hunts, incestuous religious cults, lynch mobs, or street riots, the individual ego boundaries are blurred, basic values are weakened or inverted, and what Max Scheler describes as highly infectious resentment takes over. It is not easy for individuals who have been through such traumatic experiences to fully recover their individual autonomy and self-love, and there are some who become addicted to provoking, organising and leading resentment-motivated social behaviour as it gives them the addictive high of personal power to coerce others. This is the end of the first part. The next part is entitled, Where Did the Blob Come From?